So, Antonia, I'm glad to have you here. You're from Massachusetts, which initially, when I first saw your book, I didn't realize we, of course, are in Massachusetts. For those of you who aren't aware, Antonia grew up outside of Boston. Earl and I are on the western side, but it's nice to know that we have this in common. And for those of you who aren't aware, Antonia certainly didn't just start with this book. She's won multiple awards for her journalism and storytelling, and that includes 2 Emmy Awards for her work as a correspondent with NBC, and also a Peabody Award as a co-host of the podcast South Lake, and also storytelling. So appreciate that you do storytelling. You've won some Gracie Awards for stories about women, and I also appreciated when I was looking at some of your history that you've really shared openly about what it's been like to be a Black woman in journalism and how that has impacted you as well. So I don't want to take up a lot of time talking about you because we want to hear you talk yourself. But of course, the reason we're here today is is your book that you've published, Madness, Race, and Insanity in Jim Crow Asylum. And that focuses on the 93-year history centering around Crownsville Psychiatric Hospital in Maryland. And for those of you who don't know me, I just finished this really long road trip, and my 12-year-old and I were listening to Antonia's book on in the audio form, and so appreciated being able to hear that, and being able to hear that with my child and talk about it was a really powerful experience. And this also came at a really powerful moment for us as a community as we've worked on moving the Black Movement Leaders Project forward that also recognizes a number of Black people with psychiatric histories who have taken leadership. So I'm just telling you that because I put that link in what I just sent through. So the 3 links you're going to see are Antonia's website that will give you lots of information about her book, the Black Movement Leaders Project, if you're interested in why, in particular, taking a historical look at the psychiatric system and Black communities was especially relevant in this moment. And then also the link to ask Antonia questions is that Ask AH link there at the end. So Antonia, tell us about the book.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the very kind introduction. It's really great to connect with all of you, even if it's virtually. So this book comes from a very personal place. This is for anyone who hasn't had the chance to get their hands on it, what madness looks like. I was just a freshman in college when I first stumbled into a course on the history of psychiatry and really connected and deeply fell in love with the work and scholarship, but was surprised at how little representation there was at Harvard, where I was, but also in other universities that I tried to connect with other archives that I tried to access. There was just so little about Black patients, Black doctors, psychologists, nurses, and our contributions to the field. And I knew something was off with that because I come from a family with a long history of mental health challenges. I have many loved ones in the past and present who've had to access care and who have also worked in these spaces too. And so I knew that we were there. It just seemed like we weren't represented. And so I went looking for a way to tell a story about the legacy of race in mental health and a site at which I could really explore from start to finish what these spaces look like and meant for Black communities and also for the other communities that came to work at them and for them. And I found Crownsville, one of the last segregated asylums. It closed down in 2004 and opened in 1911. So about a century of history there. And people are often shocked to hear that these places ever existed in our country, and certainly that one of them was open, within all of our lifetimes. So I tell the story of the relationship of really Black communities to these systems. And the way in which race impacts mental health outcomes through the stories of the employees, the people, and the patients who made up this place. And it's a book that's split up into 5 parts. The opening is really about this institution's its origin story. And people are often shocked when I tell them about the way that Crownsville was created. It was created right out of conversations happening at the end of emancipation as leaders, doctors in Maryland and beyond were debating what they thought to be an issue of rising Negro insanity all around the United States. their idea to respond to that was to create these segregated institutions because they believed that Black people were fundamentally different from white people. And that in many ways, the best way to take care of their mental health was to sort of recreate the antebellum social order. Many doctors and leaders bought into this idea that actually, Black people were struggling after slavery because they couldn't totally handle being free. And so we should get them back, not just into these spaces for their care, but actually really to put them back to work. So Maryland does something kind of unusual. They decide to create Crownsville, but they force its first patients to build it. So the first 12 patients to arrive at Crownsville are actually brought into the woods in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and forced to begin construction, clearing a forest, constructing roads, moving railways, and building the foundation of what turns out to be a network of massive brick structures in the sort of classic Kirkbride architectural style, right in the heart of the county, right outside of Annapolis. And even at the time, once they finished the construction on the hospital, they build for themselves. The asylum they had to build for themselves. Those patients then begin decades of really hard labor. And through archival research, oral history, photographs, and artifacts, I try to reconstruct what this institution was like for its patients from that point on, all the way up to 2004, and really argue that every era builds upon the era that comes before it. And so for those of us trying to understand why our mental health care system looks the way it does today, why so many people are only accessing care in very carceral spaces rather than truly therapeutic ones, I argue you really need to understand this, and that you can kind of go back in time and see all of our these national decisions that we've made unfold through the story of this one site. So I'm really excited to answer your question, Sera and Earl, and thank you again for having me.
Thanks. And, I realize I kind of jumped into introing you without saying, hey, we're from the Wildflower Alliance. My name's Sera. I'm here with Earl. And actually, you can also read more about Earl in the Black Movement Leaders Project because he's in there. But I'm going to turn it over to Earl to get us started with questions.
Hi, Antonia. I just want to say I found your book at Barnes and Noble. I have this very personal experience with it. And so I'm going to ask you maybe an impossible question to start. The part of the story that I really appreciate is how it's actually this massive story. It's all of these interconnected stories and the way that they all kind of fold in on each other. What story speaks to you the most? What is the one that you think of now that you've had some space from the writing of it the most? I know it's like a favorite kid question.
That's a hard question.
I do have to ask.
And I would answer this question, I think, differently on different days too. So take my answer with a grain of salt in that sense. I think all the time about the story of a patient named John, a young adolescent brought to Crownsville in the early 60s or mid 60s. He is living with his family down by the water in Annapolis in a historic Black community that now has been massively gentrified. So if you went and visited this neighborhood now, it would really be unrecognizable. So he's there in the 60s, and he really struggles in his relationship with his father and his own sort of identity and masculinity. He's very short. He's very, he doesn't weigh a whole lot. And so he's constantly trying to keep up with his father and other guys in the neighborhood. And his father just really never approves of him, even as just a young boy and a teenager. And he ends up becoming deeply depressed and struggling to eat. This was a story that was so important to me for a number of reasons. The first is at several points in the book, I try to highlight the stories of patients, of course. I really think they should be centered. And what is so upsetting to me at times that you find, because I write about it very openly in the book, is the institution and the people running it didn't really care to keep that many records about how the patients themselves were doing. A lot of it was their own theories, their own thoughts, their fights over the budget. That's a lot of what survived. But patient experience, their interior lives, it was hard to get your hands on. And so every time I was able to uncover the artwork left behind by a patient, a poem left behind by a patient, a lot of which you'll see worked into this book, I really just tried to uplift that. So John ends up suffering. He is sent to Crownsville by his family, and he's there for just a few months. but he's assigned to work with a white doctor there who many of the first Black nurses and staff members who are there at the time described to me that as they believed, that he did not enjoy working with the Black population, didn't have a lot of faith in his patients. And John ends up becoming extremely withdrawn. And as Black doctors and nurses there try to fight on his behalf, bring food to him, make sure that he's eating, give him support, this doctor continues to intervene to sort of sever all of John's relationships in the institution. And he, in fact, kind of has a meeting with the staff and tells them that he thinks that John is doing all of this for attention. What ends up happening is that John essentially starves to death at Crownsville. And within just about 3 months' time, he dies there. And I think about John all the time, and how many Johns there might be who actually do try to get care, go into some of these spaces, and instead have found doctors who don't understand the way depression and anxiety manifest in the Black community, who don't know how to have a conversation with a Black man about what or a Black young boy about what he's experiencing in the world, and don't think that those experiences are worth talking about necessarily. John isn't able to access talk therapy. He's barely able to spend time with the nurses and doctors who look like him because this doctor has so purposely intervened to sever those relationships. And so I think about John a lot because while he's the one patient who I was able to get all of his death records, able to connect with his best childhood friend to recreate the story of his life and what happens to him there, I think that story really haunts me. And I think it also haunts me because my family kind of lived it. I write in the introduction to the book that throughout, well, even now, but certainly during the pandemic, while much of the writing of this book happened, my family was fighting to get a loved one who was experiencing psychosis care. And we sent them to a facility in Massachusetts where we thought they were going to get the best of the best care. And they would call me and tell me there's not a single person of color here and when I try to talk to them in 2020 about race, I'm really having a hard time finding a nurse or doctor who cares and connects with me on this. And to be honest with all of you, I thought they were lying to me. I thought, okay, they're exaggerating what's happening to them in this place. I'm going to go visit them and see for myself. And then I went, and that was what was happening. The person assigned to work with them really was not interested in talking to them about the sort of the connection between their anxieties and fears around race in the United States and their condition. And so I think John kind of is always in the back of my mind because of that. And it's so hard, I think, for anyone to quantify how many Johns there have been. And so I was very grateful. It broke my heart reporting on that story, but I was also grateful that I was able to connect to people who loved John, so that this could be a story about who he was and who his friends are and became, and not just about his final moments at a place like Crownsville. But it's those kinds of stories that I feel and have felt just haven't really been told in media, in popular science, and in the history of psychiatry. And so I felt like it was really important to put that on the record.
Thank you so much. All right, I will ask one more question and then make way.
Go for it.
I'm sure lots of folks have. So one of the pieces in just looking at like kind of the scope of your career and the scope of this is I was struck by how much this was a story that almost ends where it starts. It ends with these folks kind of arriving at the kind of criminal justice, that carceral system, but one that's still kind of built on the bones of what their existing structure was. And then I realized that you have done some reporting on Chicago, and obviously the largest mental health facility in the country is the Cook County Jail. I wonder, in telling this story, how do you see it? Because I think on the outside, when I describe it to folks, sometimes it feels hopeless, and it's hard to sit. For me, what I took was that the thing we don't talk about in the system often is love, and that to me, this is really partly this kind of research on the hospital, but it's really about the resilience of the folks and the way that love is shown even in impossible situations. I think about when you talk about John and those folks who I think must have at some point gathered that they didn't have the credibility to change these circumstances the way they might have, but still but still make acts of love in the midst of that. Kind of, how do you think of the scope of the story?
I think you got it there. I mean, I'm glad that you point that out, because I do not sugarcoat over or try to paper over any of the horrors of this place. But at the real heart of this book is a very human story about a community that, in spite of the myths, the scientific, the pseudoscience about them that continues to permeate our culture, that in spite of the physical and racial terror that they experienced in parts of the United States for decades, despite the fact that they were barred from having jobs at Crownsville. A lot of this book deals with the messiness of integration. And actually, the fact that integration wasn't something where someone signed a law and made a decree and then Black people were allowed to show up. It was a very messy and humiliating thing for Black people to come into these places and work with people who were not shy about letting them know, I don't want you here. And I don't like the patients who look like you either. And so those very messy power dynamics are at the center of this book. But I follow through the book several families and doctors who love this community, who are of this community, who saw Crownsville, in spite of all of its challenges, as an opportunity to create a real community hospital at one point. And in my mind, a lot of those people are heroes. And they're actually starting to get their flowers now from Governor Moore in Maryland, who has met with some of them. His family, is connected to the county's efforts to try to now take all the land that Crownsville still stands on and turn it into a memorial site and a museum now. And so we're in this moment where I think they're starting to get recognition, but for decades they were denied that. And this book really is a love letter and a thanks to them. And I think you'll feel, for those of you who haven't read it, the love I have for them, because in many ways, a lot of them have become surrogate grandparents to me. And I think that in that way, it's been unlike any other reporting project I've done, because of my own personal connection to the issue. And I'm upfront with the reader about that all throughout the book. But also just the level at which I really ended up embedding with these families to, this is a history book. It's a nonfiction story, but it's also really a very human and intimate story about these people and their day-to-day fight to do what they could to save lives. And I think that a lot of us can relate to that. I've received a lot of emails and letters from readers who connect with the sort of cognitive dissonance and the conflict that a lot of them experience. This idea that you work in these different spaces in this country and you're trying to do incremental good, but sometimes the people you're working for are not necessarily, or that the system more broadly is still harming some of the people who you're trying to love on in the process. And so, what do you do at the end of the day when you go home and you ask yourself, am I a good person if I still work within this system? If I saved one person, but I know no one even had the chance to reach these three others, how do I make these calculations about what's right and wrong? And for how long do I stay? And when do I go? And these are all things I think all of us ask about the different ways in which we try to contribute to the world. And especially when you work with a community that's so stigmatized, I don't think you can show up to your job without feeling some of this in your heart pretty frequently. And so I learned so much from them about how, for Black healthcare workers, they end up in a position like, well, I have no choice, because if I leave, there will be nothing for people who look like me. So, I'm thankful for that, because I will tell you, in the moments where this book brings you down low, for example, with the story of John, you'll meet someone who's saved patients' lives or who's built a network at the hospital to protect Black healthcare workers there, and they kind of lift you back up. And you need that when you're going through a story like this.
I really do appreciate that story aspect, and it's what I think really hooked my 12-year-old in. I wasn't sure how my 12-year-old would respond to me listening to this book while we drove, but they were really like, yeah, I know, when you're going inside to the bathroom, can you leave the story on? Because they were really into some of the stories you told, and your care for them really came through. And also that, yeah,
Thank you.
and the moral injury, I think, that you're talking about, the moral injury that happens when trying to navigate these systems and do good, but know so many people are being harmed, is also obviously something that stood out. I'm going to put that link to ask questions to ask questions about Antonia again. And so bear that in mind. I have a couple of questions of my own, and then we'll be looking to the rest of you who are here. So one thing that I certainly noticed was that you were walking this line in terms of talking about equitable access to things that people were not getting. They weren't able to often be treated humanely. They weren't able to have people who looked like them or understood where they were coming from so often. And the treatments they had, the conditions they had. Then you also brought up Jonathan Metzel's work and the sort of the broader system. And then there's just the general, I think a lot of us have looked at beyond one particular marginalized group, the reality that I think the mental health system has this tendency to medicalize trauma, to medicalize human experience, to medicalize society's ills in many different ways. And I guess I'm curious in terms of where you actually land, you know, if you would say, all right, today's system that we're in, is this an issue of equity and making sure everyone has fair access to the best of what's available? Or are we in a system where, you know, we really need to say like, yeah, we're down the wrong path in general. Like our system is too focused on medicalizing people's hurts overall. And so all of it needs to change.
I'm probably farther on that end of the spectrum. I certainly think that there are issues of equity. I mean, when you just simply look at the pipeline for who gets to work in these spaces, what is it like for Black people trying to get into psychiatric residencies, trying to survive medical school? Do they have mentors and support? Those are all equity and culture related questions that I think very much still should be urgently addressed. And I know there are groups that do that, although it's harder in this climate now, certainly too. But I think that our system now is a complete failure. That's where my book really lands, I think. And, one of the things that you'll experience at the end of the book, again, for the folks who haven't read it, is that I've introduced you to these families that they have like a century-long experience at Crownsville too. There's a nurse who you'll get to know very intimately who grew up on the grounds as the daughter of one of the first Black nurses there, and then becomes a Black nurse, and then one of her close childhood friends is committed there as a patient, and you sort of see how her life and career changed through that experience. By the time the hospital closes in 2004, this woman watches her own patients get into three situations. One is transferred to what used to be a historically white-only institution, where she says that they don't get good care, they're not connected with people who know them particularly well, and it's a really challenging transition for those patients. The second is that many of them become homeless and begin living under bridges or overpasses in the Annapolis and Baltimore area. Several of the patients die in the winter from hypothermia almost immediately after being discharged. And then the third is that some of the patients that she's very connected to end up in prisons for the rest of their lives. And I even describe at one point how one of her close friends, a psychiatrist named Dr. Brian Sims, who's actually still working in Maryland today, he had created this program to support patients who had been court committed, to help them stay on their kind of these sort of 5-year plans that I'm sure you're all familiar with, very similar to parole style plans for anyone trying to transition after incarceration, where you have all these check-ins, you need to meet with your parole officer, prove you're taking your medication, blah, blah, blah. And he is trying to start this real community health initiative where he's out there going to patients' homes every single week, checking in on them, making sure they get to their appointments so that recidivism rate goes down and they're able to fully get through that 5-year period and integrate back into the community. But this is then during the Reagan era, and all the funding for his program gets taken away from him, and the rates go right back up afterward. And so the employees are grieving while their patients are sort of being re-traumatized by deinstitutionalization, frankly. And I think now when we look at, what Earl mentioned, Cook County, the LA jail system, the New Orleans jail system, Rikers here in New York, where I am, being the largest mental health care provider in New York City, I think that's an outrage. And I think some people think that's a mistake. Often when I've gone on the road talking about this book, people will ask me questions about why is it this way? And I think it was a very purposeful, I don't think we got here accidentally. And that's really toward the end of the book, one of the core arguments is that these systems are kind of genealogically connected. in many ways, especially in this second half of the 20th century, they start collaborating with each other. Police and courts are very much involved in the day-to-day operations of these asylums. Some of the patients are being swapped back and forth from jail to Crownsville to jail to Crownsville to jail. It's almost like no one really cares which one they're in. They just need them in one of the two, and whatever gets them there works. And the idea of actually healing that person, supporting that person, isn't really so much at the forefront of their care. So we see that before deinstitutionalization is even complete. And now that we are there, nobody built the clinics. Community mental health has been a real failure. We now see that a lot of those people are going to get care for the first time, support for the first time, someone even just asking them a couple questions for the first time once they're arrested and incarcerated in some form. And so I think that that's a failure. I think that I know that it's a failure because when I travel as a reporter for NBC now on almost any story, I connect with families of every background, conservative white families, Democratic Black families in Baltimore and all the other cities that I travel to. And everyone believes there's a mental health crisis. Everyone has a touch point for it now. And nobody is satisfied. Even people with good health insurance feel like they are getting screwed or they're stuck on long waiting lists. And so, yeah, I think kind of the whole thing is upside down right now. And the good news, though, is that I argue that these were choices that we made. And when you know that you've made bad choices, you can undo them. You can go back and figure out where you went wrong. And my hope is that this book helps people do that. But now we have to do that. The good news is I think we're also at this interesting moment, right, where everyone wants to talk about mental health. People are speaking more openly about the fact that they have therapists or they've tried this and that. You get commercials every day about download this meditation app or another. The problem is a lot of what's being offered to us, like those apps, kind of puts the onus on us to solve our own problem. When the truth is, this isn't something that really can be solved at the individual level. It is a systemic and a collective and a communal issue. And so we're kind of like, we're almost there to the realization, but we haven't quite realized what's really wrong here. And my hope is that when people read this book, they feel less alone. They understand that it's not an internal, like you're not at fault for where you or the people you care for and love who've gone through something similar, we don't really have this individual responsibility for it. And we're not going to actually solve it until we once again kind of come together and see it as something that's a communal responsibility.
Yeah, and there's a part in your book that was so interesting to me about that parole, sort of being you're released from the hospital, but you're essentially on parole. That's what you were just referring to, right? I just hadn't really ever heard of it being done in quite that way. And so that 5-year plan, if you don't follow the plan, then you're right back in the hospital. And it is interesting. You said somewhere in what you were just saying about how, people don't seem to care. Are you in the mental health system? Are you in the carceral system? As long as like you're not here, basically. And honestly, if you're speaking to someone who's willing to be more forthright, who works in our state Department of Mental Health, they're willing to say, yeah, I mean, we're supposed to help the individual, but we're also supposed to keep the community safe. That is a part of our mission. And so that is driving so much of it. But with that parole piece, I just hadn't ever realized that would happen. One of the things I'm curious about, though, is so there's this tension between how do we support people to have people who have similar experiences to them be represented in those providing support? So how do we have Black and Brown people able to provide the support, which is still so low, as you've already noted? But then how do we balance that against what happens in some of these systems that are still white supremacist at their roots, where people who are actually in charge are still white folks with like all the white history and things that come along with that, and they are attempting to hire Black and Brown people at the sort of lowest level to police other Black and Brown people in those systems. That's something that I'm seeing happen in psychiatric facilities that is so problematic, where it's kind of like you've taken, like you're trying to answer that, like, see, we do hire Black and Brown people, but we're hiring them to sort of hold down the people that look like them in those systems.
Yeah, I absolutely have seen the same and spoken to patients who've reported the same. In fact, actually, my loved one, when they were in that facility in Massachusetts, sent me a text at one point saying, the last time I had an in-person conversation, the only Black person I've been able to have an in-person conversation with since I got here is the guy who picks up my trash every morning. And to him, he felt like that kind of said it all. That like he kept asking, there's not one Black doctor in this big building. There's not one nurse I could hang out with for a few minutes. It's the guy who takes out my trash who I feel the most comfortable. And that's the only level at which you've got diversity in this place that's considered one of the best places to get care in the country. And, you know, again, that was something where I was like, he can't be 100% right. And then I got there and was like, oh, yeah, okay. So yeah, I think that it is a problem. And one of the things that I found most interesting to report on in the book, but also broke my heart a bit, was just there is this shift at Crownsville, and it really comes in the late 70s and 80s. This finally Black superintendent, Black administrators, Black doctors, Black staff members, Black aides, Black patients, as well as some other patients, because at that point desegregation has happened, even though Crownsville still is sort of seen as the public Black hospital. And they, at the moment that they start a bunch of innovative programs, I talk about this family that builds up a recreation department at Crownsville, and people start coming to copy their dance therapy, the musical programs they put on for the patients, the talent shows that they do. They have start a camping program, and all these other groups start copying the work that they do. But at the moment that they're actually starting to see some success, they're starting to get their budget just slashed, to the point where the guy who runs the recreation department no longer even has an office in the building. So he sits in his car in the parking lot to do work for on the behalf of patients for hours in the day. And to them, they saw that as, you know, of course they knew the whole system was under immense strain, but they felt like their position as historically the Black hospital, the hospital that had the least pharmaceutical relationships, the least notoriety and sort of support from the state, fewer connections to Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, they are the first to get kind of screwed, the rug out from under them at the end of the day. And so they basically felt, you know, the moment that Black people got even close to power, to being in the positions where they're the administration and they're really able to build the teams that they think these patients deserve, the goalposts start moving. That's how they always describe it. And I think they're kind of cynical about that. And they question whether even now they would ever be allowed to recreate something like that again. You know, it was like this fleeting moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that story of like, you know, how do we make it all look like a failure? Well, we surround them with conditions that make it impossible and then say, look, sorry, you know, and even with the parole thing, like, could we not offer the influx of support without that weird force stuff? So much gets distorted and all that. So I'm going to turn it over to Earl to see what questions we have from everybody else.
Okay, so I'll get going with our first one. Given the way the mental health industrial complex has been structured to pathologize and criminalize identities and or experiences of Blackness, queerness, poverty, etc., do you believe that it is still possible to reform the system? And what do you imagine that might look like? I think that may be a little bit of a relook or a rewording of a question you've already had, but if you have any more thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we're at a point of needing to do a deep reworking. And as I said in answer to Sarah's earlier question, I'm not of the belief that if we just create a couple diversity programs and get a couple more Black people through, that all these problems will go away. I think, I mean, just even the financials of this aren't working right now. And the reimbursement aspect here, like there is an argument to be made for really starting over in some sense. I'm not one of those people who thinks we need to go back to, you know, as we've seen people start to argue now, like just open back up the asylums, like let's do that again. I don't think, I mean, one of the arguments of this book is that like when you found a system on all of these myths and ideas about people, and you construct, I mean, literally the physical spaces and your programs with really racist and terrible beliefs in mind, no matter what changes the people who come in, you know, try to make, you're never really going to become a real place of health and healing. And so I'm not one of those people who thinks Crownsville should just be renovated, reopened, and let's try that one more time, with a few more dollars and a few more Black people present. I do now when I'm on the road and people ask me like, well, what do I do? Or what am I fighting for? Or what do I ask for? I try to tell people a couple things. The first is that mental health is everything. So if you are feeling overwhelmed by the fact that we don't really have any politicians offering anything in the way of a community mental health plan, or honestly, even talking about it. No, I don't even think it came up at the debate at all, for example. Well, mental health is very much connected to having good public schools, good public parks and spaces. It has connections to basically any kind of public good. So find ways to push for candidates and people in your local community who actually care about those projects, because all of those things are interconnected, especially when we're talking about young people right now. The other thing that I try to do for people, because I'm a journalist and not a doctor who gets to kind of like, I should never be in charge of actually designing any of these programs or telling experts what to do. But I try to kind of combat people's apathy and nihilism at times by pointing out ways in which they can get immediately involved, either in their own community or in relation with their own family members, to offer them better support. I write about at one point this story that people in my family who are my family's half African American and half Afro-Cuban. On the Caribbean Cuban side of my family, there's this story of some of you may have heard about a boy who picks up starfish on the beach. And this is sort of how I describe it to people who feel very low right now. There's been a terrible storm, and all of these starfish have washed up on the beach in Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, wherever you would like to be in your mind. And this boy arrives in the morning and he sees all these starfish there, and he starts walking along the beach, picking one up, throwing it back into the water, picking another up, throwing it back into the water, trying to save their lives before they dehydrate in the sun. An old man walks out, tells the boy, you know, this is pointless. You're wasting your time. There's thousands of starfish washed up here. You should go home. It doesn't matter. And the boy leans down, picks up one more starfish, throws it back in the water, and said, well, it mattered for that one. And that's the kind of attitude I try to carry. I mean, it's the only thing that keeps me going as a reporter, for example, under the conditions that reporters are reporting right now. I think we're all very familiar with. I think it's probably the only thing that keeps at least the healthcare workers I've grown to know going at this moment, is this idea that, you know, if you can root yourself, like put your feet on the ground that you are on and reach out to the people you can actually touch, that you will be able to keep going. And if you look a little too far out and you allow yourself to see everything as just a complete failure, everything is going to collapse around us right now. And so I think there's sort of two planes we all have to operate on. One is like building a movement to actually pressure our public officials to do something about all of this. And then the other is the sort of interpersonal plane of how do I show up for people every day and remind myself and keep myself alive in that sense, so that that kind of apathy doesn't creep in. Some of the other pieces of this, like what the exact like legislation would look like, or exactly what I would tell you know, leaders of an organization or a hospital to do right now. As a reporter, I shy back from saying, because I try to recognize my place. Like, this is a book that I built by getting to know people who I think are really brilliant and trying to put their voices first. Because for so long, especially for Black healthcare workers and patients, their voices just haven't been told. So I try to not say this is my idea. I try to say what you're going to learn by the time you get to the end of the book is that there are actually a lot of brilliant people who worked at these places who want to point us in a certain way forward, and we just haven't heard from them. So let's try to put them at the front right now.
And I love that. And I want to challenge it just a little bit because I think you spent so much time walking with, listening to either, in writings or actually meeting with and talking with people, like their stories and what they've done. And sometimes that's more than healthcare providers, the people, particularly in these leadership positions, have time to do or have been directed to do. And so in some ways you might actually have insight that, say, a doctor heading up a big hospital might just not have had the opportunity to have. And I particularly also want to lift up the fact that you spent so much time with the people who were hospitalized in those places, who were held there, because I think sometimes we fall into this like, well, I'm not a doctor, but um, I think doctors who are doing their job well absolutely have value. And then those other stories are sometimes where the greatest wisdom are the people who know what it's like to lose the level of power you lose when you go in those facilities and to be treated well or not be treated well or experience what that's like. And that was part of our work in doing the Black Movement Leaders project, because that's where we took people who've also like been in those places and then become leaders in this movement and really lift up their voices. But I wouldn't estimate the power you have now, having spent so much time with those people and with those stories. I'm just going to put that link in again for the Black Movement Leaders project if people are interested.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, go ahead.
Antonia, another light question. What do you think the Supreme Court's decision to punish people for being homeless means for the mental health and criminal justice systems?
Honestly, I'm still processing that news. I'm not particularly surprised by that decision, given the direction of the court. But I do not think it is for people who love these patients, who work in these spaces, who are trying to find housing and support. I think it's about to get exponentially more difficult. And as a reporter, I think my responsibility and my piece in this is going to be to tell those stories and go out there and make sure that Americans are aware of what this looks like and what this means. Yeah, I certainly do not think that if you are someone who works with or has ever experienced houselessness and that this is going to be a help in any way in the coming days and years. But I also know that there are a lot of communities that are going to mobilize now. So in addition to telling the story of what this looks like for the patients, I think I'm also going to be trying to tell the stories of the people who are going to step up, the sort of mutual aid and programs and sort of grassroots stuff that's going to be built in the meantime. That's the role I see myself being able to play in this moment now.
One of the things I felt so clearly is like, I think usually when you hear these stories, the kind of politics are in the foreground of them. And you really do see the trajectory of the hospital influenced by these big national political movements. I think of that place you were talking about where they had these resources that were working and the funding was getting pulled. And in a lot of ways, it does feel like the late 70s, early 80s again in this kind of regressive space we're in. But I just wanted to go back to the first chapter, which I'm really stuck with the story of these 12 human beings forced to build their own cage. I think it is a historical trauma. And it was one of those stories that, like, in reading it, felt like, how did I not know this happened? What was your experience learning this? Is this something you came into this project knowing? And also, how does that story kind of understood in that community?
Well, I will tell you, I did not know about this when I first started. This is not something that was taught to me. I found this in archival records and in conversations with people in this community. And actually, large portions of the Black community surrounding Annapolis and sort of the broader DMV area was not aware that this was how the hospital was constructed, because when they came to work there, they were not informed of the hospital's history. They weren't told they were walking into buildings that had been built by slave labor, even though that's the truth. And in fact, the state was so proud of that the way we know this to be true is that the state published reports through their Lunacy Commission, which is basically what they used to call their Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. The Lunacy Commission would publish these biannual and annual reports describing in really enthusiastic detail that they were able to get 10 and 12-year-old boys, some of whom had physical disabilities, to work long hours supporting the laborers or working under contractors and electricians, that they describe forcing people who they labeled as maniacs and murderers, who successfully were transformed into great field workers. I mean, they just openly put this all out there, because for them, this was all about making the patients offset the cost of their own care. This was all about Maryland extracting something from these people who they felt didn't actually really deserve therapy. They certainly didn't deserve it without having to do a whole lot of hard work first. And they tell on themselves in the records, in their letters, in their own reports, and in hospital memos. And even after the hospital, I mentioned this briefly at the top, but even after the hospital's actually, the construction is done, the patients are, marched into the rooms and the wards, they then force patients to construct and lead a massive farm that uses very modern, intricate irrigation practices. And despite the fact that Crownsville is actually smaller than its peer white institutions, because the Black community in Maryland is smaller than the white majority at the time, their farm is way larger, and it far outproduces any other farm at a hospital in the state. They are forced to run a rug shop, a carpentry, and all of these things are sold to offset their care. Many of the patients are brought from different parts of the South. They're extremely talented basket weavers. The hospital sells their baskets to offset the cost of their care. And we know this not just because they bragged about it in writing. You can actually see ledgers where they show the money that they made off of the things these patients created. But they also photographed the patients doing this work. We have photographs in the book of them doing field work. We have photographs of them making baskets. We have the story of Polly Murray's father, who was sent to Crownsville. This is an iconic civil rights activist. Many people don't know her father was sent to Crownsville for the years that he was alive there, worked in the rug shop. And we know through the family's records, all of his rugs were sold for the hospital to make money. His life comes to an end because a racist white guard murders him there. And the family tries to make a sort of employee benefits claim after his murder, a workman's compensation claim. And he's denied and told by the family's told that he wasn't a real employee, and therefore they're not actually liable for anything and will not be awarded any money. And so it is, essentially slavery by another name in that period of the hospital's founding.
It strikes me that like the heart of this is kind of a conversation around race. It also seems like the staff there through this long period have a particular vitriol for the culture of the Black folks who live around the hospital, and it feels like a significant amount of folks are there because they're Black and because they come from a culture that feels so significantly different. Can you talk a little bit about what that culture felt like to be so tied into for a while, what these communities are like these days and how they make sense of this kind of? I imagine that part of your reporting must have been some grappling with an understanding of what actually happened there.
Yeah, I mean, the Black communities in the DMV area are extremely engaged with the book, which has meant so much to me, to the point where I actually go back still almost every other week now to still do book events and library visits, because there's just such a demand and interest in the story because of so many people's familial connections to this institution, because the county is about to start this massive public history and memorial project that so many people are getting involved in, and frankly is starting to become a little bit political, and just there are a lot of competing interests around, well, what do we do with 500 acres of stunning land in the middle of the county seat and right outside of our capital in our state? There are a lot of interests about who's going to be served, what kind of public parks and spaces will be available, what nonprofits might get building space and good deals. And so, there's an urgency in the community now around this. In terms of what that community is like, the Black communities in Maryland and along the Chesapeake are extremely tight-knit. And they have a really sort of fascinating connection to the water and to the land there. The water, because many of them are descendants of slaves brought to Crownsville right through the Chesapeake, right at the sort of iconic Annapolis dock that many people may have seen photographs of or even visited before. This is the site where Kunta Kinte was brought to America and sold into slavery right from a ship. This is also a part of the country where there was a mix of the sort of regular sort of agricultural understandings we have of what slave labor looked like, but also there were people leading breeding farms along the Eastern Shore for the sort of express purpose of just creating and selling human beings all throughout the United States. Black people had used water and seafood as ways to get nourishment for their entire existence. And so there are a lot of themes about Black people's connection to the land and water, and the way in which water and land in Maryland become ways represent enslavement and tragedy, but also represent tools to reach freedom or some amount of sort of self-actualization. And so this is, you see that now, even now, Black watermen, communities built around the water, just the social networks and supports are often all constructed around those things. There are a lot of Black Chesapeake historical organizations that really do the work of telling these kinds of stories about places like Crownsville when the schools and the state and the local cities do not. One of the reasons I actually think Annapolis is such an important place to tell this story is that Annapolis is one of these like sort of dizzying American cities where white leadership have done immense amounts of work and put a lot of investment in preserving a certain part of Annapolis history, but they hate talking about slavery. They hate talking about what happened at the dock and at the ports. They didn't tell the story of Crownsville until now. They feel forced to adopt my book into local schools. But, you know, the Black community has sort of lived in a separate psychological world where they've been able to save their stories and their sense of who they are through oral history and sharing and the sort of creation of their own the separate social spaces. And Crownsville, it really represents all of that. I mean, even in that period, that messy period of integration that I talked about, you see that play out in the hospital day in and day out, just white employees coming with a completely different understanding of like what the history of Annapolis is and what they are there to do, and Black employees having a very, very different one. And these people live close together, but they sort of psychologically operate in different worlds.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to spend this afternoon with you. I hope this isn't the last time I get to hear you say these things. And the book has really been revelatory and thinking through these things. So I just wanted to appreciate you.
Thank
Give
you.
Sera a chance and to say a last word before we go.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate hearing you talk about this directly. And honestly, I really appreciate it. For those of you who aren't aware, if you listen to the audio version of the book, you're actually listening to Antonia share the story, which is not always the case with audio versions of books. So I really appreciated hearing you throughout my car ride across the country. And how many of these stories do you think are, you know, this is, I guess, sort of just like a last question. We have a few minutes. There's so many hospitals, so many stories across the United States. Do you like have a sense of, or is there anything you want to say about all the untold stories that are still out there?
Well, I think when it comes to specifically institutions like Crownsville, I think we've lost a lot. Many of these places, they closed down, they destroyed records purposefully. My great-grandfather was sent to an institution not unlike Crownsville, a segregated ward of a white majority institution in Michigan. And we were told his records were completely destroyed. There was just nothing our family could do about it. And in fact, now a company that does like haunted Halloween rides uses the place where he was sent to make money every fall. And that's very common. These places sort of get turned into these sort of disrespectful sites of tourism and I don't even know what you'd call it. Just this sort of spooky and historically disconnected sort of capitalistic project. And you know, there's not so much about, well, what actually happened here, who like, here's some way for us to remember the souls impacted by this place. And so Crownsville is both this very American story because it's representative of something that happened in basically every state. There was a Crownsville called Central State in Virginia. There was one in Georgia, North Carolina, segregated wards up in different places in the North. I mean, this was the way, I mean, during Jim Crow, this was the way Black people got mental health care, if they got it at all. And so it is a story that's representative, but it also is unique in that it is the only place that seems to have had so much survive that we can actually get our hands on. And so in that sense, I think we've lost a lot. And there are, for every one patient you get to know in this book, there are thousands and thousands of others who we're just never going to be able to hear from, to celebrate, to recognize. And, you know, I think one of the arguments I'm kind of making in this book is that for people like me who work in these spaces, who have the opportunity, the resources, the time to tell these stories, we have a sort of obligation to go out there and not just tell the breaking news about what's happening right in front of us, but to also kind of retell and recontextualize a lot of our national stories, and where we can rescue and bring things back into the fold, do that, because we have the skills and the chance to do it. But there's a lot we just simply will never know.
Yeah, I know, and that is so, it's just so awful how many stories we have lost, how much of our history we've lost, both the devastation and just the humanity, and really the successes as well, how we describe who created what today. There's so much that is getting lost. So I guess I would just want to echo what you're saying, hopefully out to everyone who's listening now or might watch the recording. It's kind of a call to action to preserve what history we have access to now. I want to highlight Vanessa Jackson's work also as one of the only other pieces that I'm aware about there
She's
that looks
amazing. Yeah.
yeah.
She and I are friends. She
Yeah.
contributed. She's cited in my book. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's also in our Black Movement Leaders Project. So there's little bits and pieces, and how can we lift those up? How can we lift your book up? And how can we lift up the stories that each of us might be carrying or have some connection to, so they don't continue to get lost. So thank you so much for spending this hour with us.
Thank you for having me. It really is wonderful. This book means the world to me. So to know that there are people, communities, especially communities with lived experience and or, you know, professional experience in this space to care about, and just to see them resonate with the stories here, it means everything to me. So thank you for having me.